I have a few more questions for you that I didn't have a chance to ask a couple weeks ago. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hands again. Can we try would everyone raise your hand? Excellent. Very nice job. And now no one raise your hand? Okay, good. I think we're going to be able to do this. Would you raise your hand if you consider this community to be your spiritual home, whether you would use that S word or not? Let's see. Thanks. And how about if you're checking this place out? Maybe you visited a few times, maybe this is even your first time. Anybody willing to say they're checking this place out? Or maybe it's somewhere in between. Anybody feeling like, oh yeah, I'm still, yeah? Maybe a couple of those categories. Good, okay. How about if you've been coming long enough to consider yourself a leader here in any way, self-described? Go ahead and own it. Who's a leader here? That's all? Okay, no, that's good. Thank you. We had a wonderful gathering with many leaders. There were 50 of us about yesterday here for a startup workshop about this new shared ministry we're endeavoring on together. What about long enough that you have had kids grow up here and who are off now as adults? Yeah. Or almost adults. Is there anyone who grew up here in this church yourself? I thought there were a few of you. And how about another Unitarian Universalist congregation? Yeah. And now, whether it's been that long or not, would you raise your hand if you are sitting in the same place you always sit when you're in this room? About half of us, maybe. Yeah, feel free to look around. I don't think you're the only one who sees this. We talked about yesterday the expectation I heard from those gathered that I will remind you can move your seats. We'll see how that goes. Okay, how about, I'm just really curious, if you were thinking back to when you were in 7th grade, 8th grade, and you could have chosen where to sit in the classroom, would you have sat right up front? I was a right up fronter. Other, yes, yeah. Right in the very front where you could, the teacher would see your hand right away when you stuck it up with the right answer, yeah. No, just so you could see, yes, or had bad eyesight, yeah. Well, and how about if you were a back of the roomer? You did not want to be seen in that classroom. Maybe, or you had another reason, yeah, okay. Oh, we've got a good mix here, that's good. Okay, now, also when you were in grade 7, grade 8, did you wear a seatbelt in the car? Raise your hand if you were seatbelts around when you were in 7th or 8th grade? Wow, that's not very many of us. Okay, all right. Good to know. How about, did you learn the Dewey Decimal System on card catalogs? A lot more of us, okay. More Dewey Decimal than seatbelts, okay. And how about visiting your grandparents on a farm? Who had grandparents that had a farm that you would visit on? Yeah. Not me. I think we'd have to go 4 or 5 generations back now. How about, did you come home for lunch from school? Did you raise your hand if you, yeah. That always seemed kind of like a romantic idea to me, but now as a parent, I can't imagine. That sounds so stressful. Okay, all right, just a couple more. Did you learn to type growing up? Wow, okay, yeah. And keep your hand up, did you learn on computers? I learned on a computer in 6th grade how to type. Okay, a small handful of us. How about, did you learn on an electric typewriter? Anybody? Okay, and how about, did you learn on a mechanical typewriter? Okay, yeah. All right, that's all I need to know for now. Change. So we're going to be talking about this theological house that we've inherited and our living tradition, which holds that it is a house always under construction, a house being renovated all the time, which you know, if you've ever had home repairs, it doesn't seem like such a comfortable place to be. And it isn't always. Rebecca Parker, who was the president of the seminary Starr King when I was a student there, developed this idea of using the house as a metaphor to talk about our systematic theology as a talk for the Liberal Religious Educators Association. And then later on, she and John Burens, who spoke here just last month, wrote a book together, A House for Hope. So if you want to read along over these next, we'll be doing this worship series through much of October. I invite you to read that book if you haven't. It's a lovely introduction to Unitarian Universalist theology, our liberal home. Each element of the house represents a piece of what we call systemic theology or systematic theology. And those are the areas that come out of Christianity, but are questions that every religion wrestles with. And so the walls that we start with this week represent our ecclesiology. What does it mean to be a spiritual community? Why do you need a community in the pursuit of religion? And what's its form? What's its shape? How do we do it? What are the walls that shape our gathering? I have to tell you, I first preached about this question when I was 16 years old because I was really into church, and I think it was a little weird as a teenager to be so into church, and I needed to figure out why. Why church? I remember in ninth grade, I was in my ethnic studies class at Berkeley High School, and we did one of those exercises, kind of like what we just did, but everybody would stand up for various identities or things that people believed, and so the teacher would call something out, stand up if this, or stand up if that, and everyone would stand or remain seated, and then she asked, stand up if you're religious. And I have to tell you, I went to church every Sunday. I just had a really meaningful experience of my coming of age program where I dove deep into retreats throughout the year. They were some of my closest friends. I was on the leadership council for our district youth program, and it did not occur to me to stand up. Luckily, I had a good friend sitting next to me who knew a little bit about my life, and she leaned over and whispered, "You're totally religious." and I realized, yes, I was, and I stood up. But I don't think I'm alone in this experience. I know a lot of us joke these days that it's easier to come out as a lot of other things than it is to tell the people you work with or the friends you have who don't go to church that you're religious, that you go to church. And I know for many of us even here, even saying coming to church, it's one of those wounded words. We'll talk about those in an ongoing way, I'm sure, but one of those wounded words that carries such emotional baggage from the cultural harm that has happened. We know why. We know why we don't want to come out as religious. Religion has a bad rap for good reasons. I am thinking about how tomorrow is the anniversary of September 11th. And remembering I was in 10th grade. That morning, waking up, many of us have those flashbulb memories. And that morning, having a symbol that was so powerful, so visceral, so overwhelming, that landed right alongside all the other symbols that were already out there about what religion wanted for the world. That religion wanted to have a fight against safe and legal abortion. That religion wanted to keep people who were not straight out of the public eye, keep them out of the world entirely. That religion wanted war and divisiveness, violence and division and hatred. Why aren't millennials or Gen Z going to church. Well, why would they if that's what religion wants for the world? And you know, it also symbolized that moment, one of those times of the disruption to the naive optimism that we've sometimes used to build the walls of our liberal religious community. Do you know what I'm talking about? We've called it, James Freeman Clarke in the late 1800s, he penned the 5 points of the new theology, and the last one was the progress of mankind onward and upward forever. And over again, generation by generation, whether it's the Holocaust or the atomic bombs, whether it's 9/11 or the threats to our democracy, we know that the progress of our species onward and upward forever is not a guarantee. But when Clarke penned those lines, he was working at, along with the community he was a part of, a renovation that we have worked at over and over again in our history. Like every development in our theological tradition, it came about from people looking around the theological house that they had inherited and seeing the need for a little change. We could go back to our ancestors of the Reformation who saw the ways that the Catholic Church had become corrupt, had aligned itself too closely with the powers of the state, with kings and queens and empire, and who had used the power of the pulpit and the power of imagery to shape lives that were too small for the people who were leading them. What we did, what our spiritual ancestors did in that moment, was throw out all of the art, have bare walls. We couldn't trust what had been taken advantage of through the senses, and returned, those Protestants returned to the Word, and we're still, I think, recovering in some ways, finding out what does it mean to bring our senses, bring art back into our religious life, bring the body back into the religious life. We renovate and we get it wrong. And we renovate again. And sometimes getting it wrong will break your heart. Church will break your heart. It's one of the things that I make sure I tell people joining any congregation that I've served. Because, you know, you're a newcomer, you're a new member, and it looks pretty good, especially compared to maybe other places that you've been, and yet there's something about that pink cloud that might get in the way of seeing the reality that it's going to break your heart. And so I ask people, what will you do when this place breaks your heart? One time I had my heart broken by church was when I was 20 years old, and my church split. There was a big fight over music and culture, who was welcome, over power and authority. You know, just small stuff at church. And the church split, and it broke my heart because it felt like the community that had raised me was betraying one of the core values they had taught me, that the cornerstone of our walls, this sense of covenant, of how we are with one another, had been broken. Covenant. I know that we have a tradition of saying this covenant each week, covenants that have been created. I'm sure many of you have made covenants over and over again. I think sometimes we forget, though, in that practice of weaving words together to shape a covenant, that a covenant, before we make one with words is something that we are born into, that we inherit. Rebecca Parker puts it like this. She says, "We receive who we are before we choose who we will become. We are born into relationship before we shape them by our conscious intention." But we want to shape them. We want to be in control. And so I think sometimes we take this big idea of covenant, this relational reality that we are born into, and we try and shrink it down to a size we can understand. And in so doing, I think sometimes we make it too small, as though the words we use could design walls that will shape a religious community into neat and tidy rooms that will keep us safe no matter what. Parker, she goes on to say, Unitarian Universalists, they often speak of covenant as a verbal statement of promise between individuals who, exercising their freedom of choice, bring community into being. She says there's historical reasons why we think this way. It's an expression of the dominance of an individualistic understanding of human existence. First comes the individual, then the community. But our times demand that we think in other ways about the relationship between the individual and the community. The limits of a merely individualistic understanding of human existence are pressing upon us, she says. Our attachment to an economic system that maximizes self-interest has broken our covenant with the earth and with one another. You know, the cardinal sin, I think, of the culture, the dominant culture that I grew up in, that most of us make our way through daily, the cardinal sin is to need help. Fundamentally, our ecclesiology, our way of being church, our belief about the importance, the necessity, the opportunity of spiritual community is a way to rebuff this thinking, to say, no, we need one another. Our lives are born and end in a relational network of necessity. Thich Nhat Hanh, I heard say once, the next Buddha will take the form of a community. And I think he was speaking to that shift in thinking that Rebecca Parker is naming, this idea that the community might come before the individual. Some religious traditions, they look out at the world and they say, what is wrong with the world is sin, sinfulness, people behaving badly, and what is needed is redemption and repentance. We look out of the world and we see it a little differently. We say what's happening is disconnection. People are disconnected from ourselves, from one another, and from the world. And what we need is connection. This is a theology of connection. And we're coming to understand more and more just about how that connection works in our physiological beings, right? Attachment theory has just, over the last 50, 60, 70 years, since those early studies of rhesus monkeys, you know those studies, right, of the mother who was the padded mother, or the mother who was the mechanical mother, who one had milk, the mechanical one, or the soft, cuddly teddy bear kind of one was the one the babies would choose, even though it didn't have food, because they needed that body-to-body connection. That quality of connection, of attachment, is so fundamental to what it means to be alive, and certainly what it means to be a human being. And now neuroscience is explaining more and more in depth through our understanding of how mirror neurons and the entire parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems work, how that attachment system is cultivated, programmed in the families we grew up in, and how we can work towards freedom and connection with it as adults. Because the truth is, none of us are loved exactly as we need to be. None of us grow up getting just the right thing. And so all of us are left hungry, left wondering, left wandering. And church, in my greatest hopes, can be a place where we come to practice what it means to organize ourselves, to reattach ourselves in our human relationships and to whatever quality we understand to be holding us all. Some of us call it God, some of us talk about life, some of us talk about a core self. Whatever it is that we understand, we have to reorganize ourselves through relationship. And that's what church is about. So I know that the pandemic blew a few holes in the wall. It might have torn a few holes itself, but even more, it ripped the shoddy patchwork off of walls that maybe had been crumbling for decades. It revealed, it made acute the need for renovating our ways of being church. And I know it's tempting to just slap those patches, with the wires and throw the spackle on top and just try and get it looking back nice as quickly as possible. But perhaps it might be good to talk about whether we've got the walls where we want them. Maybe some of those holes would be good to keep. Maybe we need to enlarge a few, have more pass-throughs, or maybe it's time for an open floor plan. Maybe this era of uncertainty calls for more room to move around, to try connecting in new configurations. The meeting, the moment that I remember from the church split that broke my heart. It was a congregational meeting. And the temperature in the room had gotten quite hot. And an elder in the community raised her hand and said, "I wonder if we could take a moment to sing a song." And there were a chorus of no's shouted back at her. And it ripped my heart out. I couldn't believe this was my community, and you could just have to imagine my 20-year-old self kind of with this overwhelm. And so when I had a chance to speak, I just blubbered my way through how heartbroken I was feeling, how it didn't reflect the values that I had learned there. And I was lucky enough to be part of a religious community that even in the midst of a great trauma could hear a cracked and sobbing, angry and confused, broken-hearted voice. And another elder started to sing, "We are a gentle, angry people." And we did. We sang. And it didn't patch up all the holes. The walls still needed to be taken down and rebuilt in new ways. But it restored some of my faith that we can break the covenant and still rebuild it. That first sermon at 16, when I first tried to wrestle with this question, why church, I shared this quote, and so I want to leave you with this. It's from the pagan teacher-writer Starhawk. "We are all longing to go home to some place we have never been. A place half remembered and half envisioned we can only catch glimpses of from time to time. Community. Somewhere there are people to whom we can speak with passion without having the words catch in our throats. Somewhere, a circle of hands will open to receive us, eyes will light up as we enter, voices will celebrate with us whenever we come into our power. Community means strength that joins our strength to do the work that needs to be done. Arms to hold us when we falter. A circle of healing. A circle of friends. Some place where we can be free. May we continue making such a place together. The Messiah is among us. Amen. And may it be so.